Hey everyone, welcome back. We've got another round of Reddit chaos today, and if you're here for the Minecraft vibes and the absolute disasters people call their lives, you're in the right place. Grab something to drink, get comfortable, and let's jump in. Because today's stories prove trust is a gamble, and some people are terrible at poker. Before we dive in, quick thank you to everyone who's been liking and commenting lately. It genuinely means a lot. Your support has been awesome, and you're a big part of why this channel keeps growing. And hey, we're on the road to 1,000 subs. If you're enjoying the videos, hit subscribe and help us get there. Alright, let's get this started. Today's first story involves a best friend, a startup job offer, and the kind of betrayal that makes you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty. I was struggling to find work when my best friend since college, Marcus, offered me a position at his startup. After months of sending out resumes and getting nowhere, hearing from him felt like a lifeline. He pitched it as helping each other out, said he needed someone he could trust to help get the company off the ground. I'd known Marcus for almost a decade at that point. We'd pulled all-nighters studying together, celebrated every milestone, been in each other's weddings. So when he said he wanted me on his team, I didn't hesitate. I accepted immediately. The job itself seemed straightforward enough. I was brought on to help manage operations and handle some of the day-to-day financial tracking. Nothing too complex, just keeping things organized while Marcus focused on the bigger picture. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was steady. And honestly, I was just relieved to have something. For the first few weeks, everything felt fine. I was learning the systems, meeting the small team Marcus had assembled, and trying to prove I deserved to be there. He kept telling me how grateful he was to have someone reliable he could count on. I felt like I was finally contributing to something meaningful. But within a few months, I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. There were irregular financial records, invoices that didn't match up with what was in the system, payments that seemed to disappear into thin air. At first, I thought maybe I was just missing something. I was still new after all, and startups are chaotic by nature. But the more I dug into it, the more inconsistencies I found. It wasn't just one or two mistakes. It was a pattern. So I went to Marcus. I figured he'd want to know, right? These were his investors' money we were talking about. I sat him down one afternoon and walked him through what I'd found. Kept my tone casual, didn't want to sound accusatory. I genuinely thought it was just disorganization, growing pains from scaling too fast. Marcus barely looked at the documents I'd printed out. He waved his hand dismissively and told me not to worry about it. Said it was just growing pains, that things were moving fast and some wires got crossed. He assured me he'd handle it and that I should focus on my own responsibilities. I wanted to believe him. This was my best friend. So I dropped it and went back to work, convinced myself he knew what he was doing. But the irregularities didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. Then came the breaking point. A few months later, Marcus announced that our investors were coming in for a formal audit. He called it routine, said it was just standard procedure to keep everyone aligned. The energy in the office shifted immediately. People were scrambling to get reports together, double-checking everything. I felt a knot forming in my stomach because I knew what they were going to find. I tried to talk to Marcus again before the audit, told him we needed to get ahead of this and clean up the discrepancies. He told me to relax, said he had it under control. The investors arrived on a Thursday morning. Marcus scheduled an emergency all-hands meeting that afternoon, and I thought maybe he was finally going to come clean, explain what had been happening, and take responsibility. Instead, he stood up in front of the entire team and the investors and said that I had been handling the finances incorrectly. He said there had been gross negligence on my part, that I'd been making critical errors for months, and that the financial irregularities were a direct result of my incompetence. I sat there, completely frozen, as he presented doctored emails with my signature on them. Emails I'd never written, instructions I'd never given. He'd fabricated an entire paper trail to make it look like I'd been the one mismanaging funds. The investors looked at me like I was a criminal. My co-workers wouldn't even make eye contact. And Marcus just stood there, calm and composed, playing the role of the disappointed leader who'd trusted the wrong person. Then he fired me, right there, in front of everyone. Told me to pack my things and leave immediately. I've never felt humiliation like that in my entire life. I walked out of that building in a daze, my mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. My best friend had just publicly destroyed me. And for what? That's when everything unraveled. I didn't just walk away quietly like Marcus probably hoped I would. I was furious. I was humiliated. And I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I hired a lawyer that same week and handed over every document, every email, every piece of evidence I had. My lawyer tore through the company's records like a bloodhound, and it didn't take long to find what we were looking for. Marcus had been embezzling funds for months. He'd been siphoning money out of the company, using my access codes to cover his tracks, making it look like I was the one authorizing the transfers. He'd set me up from the beginning. The job offer wasn't about friendship or helping each other out. It was about finding a fool guy, someone he could trust enough to give access to the systems, someone naive enough not to ask too many questions, and someone expendable enough to throw under the bus when things started to fall apart. The audacity is breathtaking when you really think about it. He'd planned this from day one. My lawyer contacted the investors directly and handed over everything we'd found: bank records, access logs, the real email chain showing Marcus's instructions, everything. The investors launched their own investigation, and it all came crashing down on him faster than I ever could have imagined. Marcus tried to spin it, tried to claim I was retaliating because I got fired, but the evidence was irrefutable. The timestamps didn't lie, the access logs didn't lie, his own emails didn't lie. Within weeks, Marcus lost the company. The investors pulled out, the board voted him out, and what was left of the business collapsed almost immediately. But that wasn't even the worst part for him. Criminal charges were filed: fraud, embezzlement, forgery. The prosecutors built a case that was airtight, and Marcus had no way out. His reputation in the industry was obliterated. No one would touch him. He went from being this rising entrepreneur everyone wanted to work with to a cautionary tale about greed and betrayal. And me, I got a settlement from the investors, a formal apology, and my name cleared. They even offered to serve as references for future job applications, which honestly meant more to me than the money. I found new work within a few months, this time at a company with actual oversight and people I didn't have a decade of history with. But the friendship, that died the moment Marcus chose greed over loyalty. I haven't spoken to him since the day I was fired. Mutual friends tried to reach out on his behalf a few times, said he wanted to apologize, but I had no interest. There's no apology big enough to undo what he did. He didn't just betray my trust. He tried to destroy my career and my reputation to save himself. That's not something you come back from. Every now and then I think about how differently things could have gone if he'd just been honest with me from the start. If he'd asked for help instead of deciding I was disposable. But he made his choice, and he's living with the consequences. If you've made it this far into the chaos, you're as addicted to Reddit drama as I am. Make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for what's coming next. But Marcus wasn't the only person in my life who thought betrayal was a survival strategy. Speaking of being labeled something you're not, wait until you hear what happened when someone refused to play along with a family's carefully crafted lies. My cousin's wedding was supposed to be perfect. Emma had been planning it for over a year, and I was honored when she asked me to be a bridesmaid. We'd grown up together, more like sisters than cousins, and I was genuinely excited to celebrate this moment with her. She'd met Tyler about 2 years earlier, and he seemed like a decent guy. Charming, successful, treated her well from what I could see. I had no reason to think anything was wrong, until 2 weeks before the ceremony, when I saw him with another woman at a restaurant across town. I was there for a work dinner, seated near the back of the place, when I spotted Tyler at a corner table. At first I thought maybe it was a business meeting or something innocent, but then I watched him reach across the table and hold her hand, watched him lean in and kiss her. Not a friendly peck, a full, romantic kiss. My stomach dropped. I sat there frozen, trying to process what I was seeing, hoping maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was someone who just looked like Tyler, but it was him. No question about it. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the scene in my head, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to pretend I'd never seen it, to just let things play out and stay out of it. Weddings are stressful enough without adding drama. But the other part of me, the part that loved my cousin and wanted what was best for her, knew she deserved to know the truth. She deserved to make an informed decision before she legally tied herself to this guy. I agonized over it for days. I talked myself in and out of saying something a dozen times. But ultimately, I decided she deserved to know. I couldn't let her walk into a marriage built on lies, so I asked her to meet me for coffee, somewhere private where we could talk. I rehearsed what I was going to say, tried to figure out the gentlest way to deliver devastating news. When I told her, she broke down immediately. Tears, disbelief, asking me if I was sure. I told her exactly what I'd seen, where, when, all the details. For a moment, I thought she believed me. She looked shattered, and then something shifted. She grew angry. At me. She accused me of being jealous, of trying to ruin her happiness because I was still single. Said I'd always been competitive with her and that this was a new low. I tried to explain that I had no reason to lie, that I was only telling her because I cared about her, but she wasn't hearing it. She stood up, told me I was a terrible person, and walked out. And here's where it gets absurd. Instead of confronting Tyler or even considering that what I'd told her might be true, Emma went straight to her parents and told them I was spreading vicious lies about her fiancé. She painted me as bitter, vindictive, someone who couldn't stand to see her happy. Her parents believed her without question. They called my parents furious, demanding to know why I would do something so cruel. My own parents were confused and hurt, asking me what was going on. I tried to explain, but the narrative had already been set. Emma's version of events had spread through the family like wildfire. Within days, I was uninvited from the wedding, not just as a bridesmaid, but from attending at all. Emma's parents sent me a formal message saying I wasn't welcome and that my presence would only cause problems. Other family members started reaching out, some to scold me, others to ask what had happened. I tried defending myself, tried explaining that I'd only been trying to help, but no one wanted to hear it. The family had chosen sides, and I wasn't on the winning team. I was painted as the villain, the jealous cousin who couldn't handle someone else's happiness, the troublemaker, the liar. People I'd known my entire life were looking at me like I was a stranger, someone capable of cruelty they'd never imagined. And the worst part, I had no way to prove what I'd seen. It was my word against Tyler's, and Emma had already decided who she believed. The wedding happened without me. I saw the photos on social media, Emma looking radiant in her dress, surrounded by family and friends, everyone smiling, celebrating, completely oblivious to the truth. I felt sick looking at them, not because I wanted to be there, but because I knew what was coming. I knew Tyler wasn't the person they all thought he was, and I knew Emma was going to get hurt. I just didn't think it would take 6 months. Emma called me on a Tuesday afternoon, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. Tyler had left her, moved out while she was at work, took half their stuff, and sent her a text saying he was done. He'd been seeing the same woman I'd spotted him with at the restaurant, had been the entire time, and had finally decided to make it official. Emma was devastated, blindsided. She kept saying she didn't understand how this could happen, how she didn't see the signs, and then she apologized, said she was sorry for not believing me, sorry for what she'd put me through, sorry for turning the family against me. She admitted I'd been right all along. She'd known deep down that I wouldn't lie to her, but she'd been too scared to face the truth, so she'd lashed out at me instead. I wanted to feel vindicated. I wanted to feel like justice had been served, like the truth had finally come out and I'd been proven right. But mostly I just felt sad. Sad for Emma, sad for the situation, sad for what we'd lost, because the damage was done. Half the family still won't speak to me. Some of them apologized once they learned the truth, but others doubled down, said I should have handled it differently, that I'd caused unnecessary drama. A few relatives still believe I made the whole thing up, that Emma only said I was right to make herself feel better. My relationship with Emma has never fully recovered either. We talk occasionally, but there's a distance now that wasn't there before. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. The whole experience taught me that sometimes doing the right thing costs you more than you ever expected. I didn't regret telling Emma the truth. I'd do it again if I had to, but I also learned that people would rather shoot the messenger than face uncomfortable realities. They'd rather believe a comforting lie than a painful truth, and sometimes, no matter how right you are, you'll still end up being the villain in someone else's story. Looking back, I think about how different things could have been if Emma had just trusted me, if she'd confronted Tyler instead of attacking me. But she made her choice, and I made mine. I chose honesty over keeping the peace, and I'm still living with the fallout. Family drama doesn't end with weddings gone wrong. Sometimes it starts when the people who raised you make decisions behind your back that change everything. I started receiving collection calls out of nowhere. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some kind of clerical error where they'd mixed up my information with someone else's. The first call was for a credit card I'd never opened. I told them they had the wrong person and hung up. Then another call came, and another. Credit cards, personal loans, even a car lease I knew nothing about. Each time I explained there had to be some mistake, that I'd never applied for any of these things. Then I checked my credit score. It had plummeted overnight. I'm talking from the high 700s down to the low 500s. I stared at my phone in disbelief, refreshing the app like it might magically correct itself. It didn't. My stomach twisted as I started pulling my full credit report, and what I saw made me feel physically sick. There were accounts I'd never opened, inquiries I'd never authorized, debts totaling over $60,000 that I had absolutely no memory of incurring. I filed disputes immediately, contacted every creditor on the list, started building a paper trail to prove this wasn't me. But the more I dug, the more I realized this wasn't random fraud. Whoever had done this had access to everything: my social security number, my date of birth, previous addresses, all the personal information you'd need to convincingly steal someone's identity. And that's when the sinking feeling hit me. This wasn't some stranger halfway across the country. This was someone close. After weeks of investigation, cross-referencing dates and locations, and trying to figure out who could have possibly had access to all my information, I discovered the truth. My younger brother, Jake, had stolen my identity to rack up over $60,000 in debt. I found out by accident, really. One of the credit card companies sent documentation to my address, an old apartment complex where I'd lived a few years back, but that Jake had stayed at briefly when he was between jobs. The building manager forwarded it to me. Inside was an application with my social security number, but the handwriting on the physical form looked familiar. Too familiar. It was Jake's handwriting. I compared it to old birthday cards he'd sent me, and it matched perfectly. My hands were shaking as I put the pieces together. He'd been using my identity for years. Not just once or twice out of desperation, but systematically, opening accounts, taking out loans, leasing a car, all under my name. And the whole time, he'd been banking on family loyalty to keep me quiet if I ever found out. I confronted him the next day, showed up at his apartment unannounced, and laid everything out on his kitchen table. The credit report, the applications, all of it. For a moment, he tried to deny it. Then he saw the handwriting comparison, and his face just crumbled. He admitted everything, said he'd gotten into some financial trouble a few years back, made some bad decisions, and his credit was already destroyed. So he'd used mine instead. Just temporarily, he claimed. Just until he got back on his feet. Temporary turned into years. $60,000. My entire financial future jeopardized because he couldn't face the consequences of his own choices. And here's where it gets absurd. Instead of apologizing, instead of showing any real remorse, Jake begged me not to report it. He actually got on his knees and cried, saying that if I went to the police, it would ruin his life. He'd have a criminal record, he'd never get a decent job, he'd lose everything. He kept saying he was my brother, that family was supposed to protect each other, that I couldn't do this to him. I just stared at him. This man had spent years systematically destroying my credit, stealing my identity, racking up debt in my name, and now he was asking me to protect him from the consequences. The audacity was almost impressive. I told him I needed time to think and left. I didn't trust myself to make a decision in that moment because I was so angry I could barely see straight. Within hours, my parents called. Jake had gone running to them, spun some version of events where he was the victim and I was being unreasonable. They wanted to meet, said we needed to handle this as a family. So we met, and that's when things went from bad to unhinged. My parents sat me down and tried to convince me to handle it privately. They actually suggested we could set up a payment plan where Jake would slowly pay back the debt over time, keep it all in the family, no police, no lawyers, just a private arrangement. My mom even offered to help him with the payments, like that somehow made it better. They kept emphasizing that he was my brother, that family doesn't send family to jail, that I needed to think about what this would do to him. Not once did they acknowledge what he'd done to me. Not once did they seem concerned about my destroyed credit, my financial future, the years it would take to recover from this. It was all about protecting Jake from his own actions. I asked them point blank if they understood the severity of what he'd done. $60,000, years of fraud, my entire credit history destroyed. Did they get that? My dad actually said that mistakes happen and that Jake was sorry. My mum said I was being vindictive and that forgiveness was important. That's when I realized they weren't going to support me in this. They'd already chosen sides and it wasn't mine. I refused their plan. Told them flat out that I wasn't going to sacrifice my financial future for someone who'd shown zero remorse and only seemed sorry he'd gotten caught. I walked out of that meeting and went straight to the police station, filed a full report, provided every piece of evidence I had, froze my credit, and started the process of disputing every fraudulent account. Jake was arrested 2 weeks later and charged with identity theft. Multiple counts given how many accounts he'd opened. The evidence was overwhelming. He'd left a paper trail a mile long, and there was no talking his way out of it. The prosecutor told me it was one of the clearest cases of identity theft they'd seen, especially because he'd been so brazen about it for so long. My parents were furious, called me heartless, said I was destroying the family, that I'd regret this decision for the rest of my life. Other relatives started reaching out, some supportive, others echoing my parents' sentiment that I should have handled it privately. A few even suggested I was being cruel, that Jake had made a mistake and didn't deserve to have his life ruined over it. But I wasn't budging. This wasn't a mistake. Mistakes are one-time errors in judgment. This was years of calculated fraud. He'd made a choice every single time he opened an account in my name, every time he used my social security number, every time he let another month go by without coming clean. And when he finally got caught, his only concern was avoiding consequences, not making things right. The legal process took months. Jake eventually pleaded guilty as part of a deal, got probation and restitution orders, and a felony on his record. He's required to pay back the debt, though I'm not holding my breath on actually seeing that money anytime soon. The important thing was getting the charges removed from my credit report and starting the long process of rebuilding. I'm still working on it now. My credit score has improved, but it's slow going. Some of the damage will take years to fully repair. I've had to be meticulous about monitoring everything, disputing errors, providing documentation over and over again to prove I wasn't the one who opened those accounts. And my family? Half of them still won't speak to me. My parents have barely said 2 words to me since Jake was sentenced. They see me as the villain in this story, the one who chose the legal system over family loyalty. A few relatives have quietly reached out to apologize, said they didn't understand the full extent of what Jake had done until the details came out in court. But most of them are still in the camp of thinking I overreacted. Jake and I don't speak. He sent me one email after his sentencing, a half-hearted apology that spent more time explaining why he'd done it than actually taking responsibility. I didn't respond. There's nothing left to say. He made his choices and I made mine. I chose my future over his comfort, and I don't regret it for a second. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the people closest to you are capable of the worst betrayals, and that protecting yourself even when it costs you relationships is not cruel. It's necessary. I wasn't going to light myself on fire to keep someone else warm, especially someone who'd already proven they'd throw me under the bus to save themselves. I'm rebuilding my credit alone, but I'm free. Free from the debt, free from the manipulation, and free from the weight of protecting someone who never deserved it in the first place. And if you think siblings are the only ones capable of betrayal, just wait until you hear what happened when the people who were supposed to support a marriage decided to destroy it instead. I took a DNA test for fun during the holidays, one of those ancestry kits everyone was getting that year. I thought it would be interesting to see where my family came from, maybe connect with some distant cousins I didn't know about, confirm the European ancestry my parents always talked about. It seemed like a harmless way to spend an afternoon. I spit in the tube, mailed it off, and basically forgot about it until the email came back a few weeks later, saying my results were ready. I opened them on a random Tuesday evening, sitting on my couch with a glass of wine, expecting to see a breakdown of percentages and maybe a few DNA matches to fourth cousins twice removed. What I got instead was something that made my entire world tilt sideways. The results showed that my dad, the man who raised me, who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and walked me down the aisle at my wedding, wasn't my biological father. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, refreshing the page over and over, convinced there had been some kind of mistake. But the numbers didn't lie. The genetic match was clear. The man listed as my father had 0% DNA overlap with me. 0. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. I didn't know what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to pretend I'd never seen it, to delete the account and never speak of it again. But I couldn't unknow what I'd just learned. My entire childhood suddenly felt like it was built on a lie, and I needed answers. So I confronted my mom. I drove to my parents' house the next day, my hands shaking the entire time, and asked to speak with her alone. When I showed her the results, her face went completely white. She didn't try to deny it. She just sat there, frozen, and then she started to cry. She broke down completely and admitted she'd had an affair 32 years ago. A brief relationship with someone she'd worked with, something that happened during a rough patch in her marriage. She'd gotten pregnant, realized the timeline didn't match up with my dad, and made the choice to never tell anyone. Not the man she'd had the affair with, not my dad, not me. She'd carried this secret for over 3 decades, and now it was out, and then she begged me to keep it secret. She was terrified of losing her marriage, terrified of what it would do to our family, terrified of my dad finding out after all these years. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face and asked me to please not tell him. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was asking me to become complicit in the lie, to carry the weight of this secret so she wouldn't have to face the consequences of her choices. I was furious. This wasn't my burden to bear. I didn't ask to be put in this position. I didn't create this mess. And now she wanted me to protect her from the fallout. I barely slept for the next few nights. I kept thinking about my dad, about how he'd spent 32 years believing I was his biological daughter, raising me, loving me, never once questioning it. He deserved to know the truth, but I also knew that telling him would destroy him. It would destroy everything. Then came the breaking point. I realized I couldn't live with myself if I kept this from him. The lie had already stolen 32 years from all of us. I wasn't going to let it steal anymore. So I told him. I sat down with my dad, just the two of us, and I showed him the DNA results. I explained what I'd learned, what my mum had admitted, and I watched his entire world shatter in real time. He didn't yell, he didn't get angry. He just sat there, staring at the paper. And then he looked at me with this expression I'll never forget. Broken, lost, like everything he thought he knew had just been ripped away. But then he did something I didn't expect. He thanked me for my honesty. He said he was grateful I'd told him the truth, even though it hurt. He told me that no matter what the DNA said, I was still his daughter, and nothing would ever change that. I think that moment broke me more than anything else. My parents separated within months. There was no screaming, no dramatic blow-up, just a quiet, painful unraveling of a marriage that had been built on a lie. My dad moved out, and suddenly the family I'd known my entire life just didn't exist anymore. And of course, my mom's family blamed me. They said I'd destroyed the family by telling my dad that I should have kept my mouth shut and let things be. They called me selfish, said I'd prioritize my own feelings over the stability of the family. Some of them stopped speaking to me entirely. Family gatherings became battlegrounds, with people choosing sides and whispering behind my back. I became the villain in their story, the person who ruined everything. My dad's side, on the other hand, supported me. They were furious with my mum for what she'd done, and they made it clear that I was still part of the family, DNA or not. But even their support felt complicated. I could see the questions in their eyes, the way they looked at me differently now, wondering if I was really one of them. The whole thing felt like living in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But that wasn't even the worst part. I still didn't know who my biological father was. My mum had given me his name eventually, after weeks of refusing to talk about it. She told me he'd been a co-worker, that the affair had ended badly, and that he'd moved away not long after. She didn't think he even knew I existed. I spent months debating whether to reach out to him. Part of me wanted answers, wanted to know where I came from, wanted to understand the other half of my genetic story. But another part of me was terrified. What if he didn't want to know me? What if he rejected me? What if meeting him made everything worse? Eventually, I reached out. I found him on social media, sent him a carefully worded message explaining who I was and what I'd discovered. I didn't know what to expect. Radio silence, maybe. Denial. Anger. What I got was a kind, thoughtful response from a man who seemed genuinely stunned, but willing to talk. We arranged to meet a few weeks later at a coffee shop halfway between where we both lived. I was a nervous wreck walking in, but he was warm and welcoming. He told me he'd had no idea I existed, that my mum had never told him she was pregnant. He seemed sad about that, like he'd missed out on something important. We've stayed in touch since then. He's a good person, someone I might have liked knowing under different circumstances. But it's complicated. He's not my dad. He's the man who contributed half my DNA, but he didn't raise me. He wasn't there for any of it. And as kind as he is, there's no erasing 32 years of history. It's been 2 years since I got those DNA results, and I'm still processing everything. My parents' divorce is finalized. My relationship with my mom is strained at best. Some of her family still won't speak to me. My dad and I are close, but there's a sadness there now that wasn't there before. And I have this whole other person in my life, my biological father, who I'm still trying to figure out how to fit into my story. The truth set me free, but it cost me the family I thought I knew. I don't regret finding out. I don't regret telling my dad, but I also can't pretend it didn't destroy something that can never be rebuilt. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. Discovering hidden truths is painful, but sometimes the lies are happening in real time, and you're the last one to know. From day one, my mother-in-law, Patricia, made it clear I wasn't good enough for her son. It wasn't anything she said directly at first, just this constant undercurrent of disapproval in every interaction. The way she'd look me up and down when I arrived at family gatherings, the tight smile she'd give when my husband introduced me, the subtle way she'd redirect conversations away from me whenever I tried to participate. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I just needed to give it time, that she'd warm up to me eventually. She didn't. If anything, it got worse after we got married. Patricia would undermine me at every opportunity. At family dinners, she'd make passive-aggressive comments about my career, saying things like how nice it must be to have a job with so much free time, implying I didn't work as hard as everyone else. She'd bring up my husband's ex-girlfriend, talk about how accomplished she was, how the family had loved her. She'd accidentally exclude me from events, claim she forgot to add me to the group text, or didn't realize I'd want to come to some family outing. It was death by 1,000 cuts, but I bit my tongue. I kept the peace. My husband loved his family, and I didn't want to be the person who created division. I figured if I just stayed pleasant and patient, she'd eventually accept me. I was willing to put in the work. Then my husband and I started trying for a baby. We'd been married for about 3 years at that point, both stable in our careers, ready to start the next chapter. But months went by with no success, then a year. We started seeing specialists, going through tests, trying to figure out what was going on. It was emotionally exhausting, the kind of thing that puts stress on even the strongest relationships. We were dealing with it privately, trying to stay hopeful. And then I found out Patricia had been telling relatives I was defective. That's the word she used, defective, like I was a broken appliance. She'd been spreading it around the family that I couldn't give her son children, that there was something wrong with me, that maybe he should reconsider his choice in spouse. People started looking at me with pity at family gatherings, asking intrusive questions about our plans, offering unsolicited advice about fertility treatments. I felt humiliated. My husband confronted her about it, told her she was out of line and needed to stay out of our personal business. She apologized, said she was just worried about him, that she didn't mean any harm. He believed her. I didn't. But I let it go because what choice did I have? Starting a war with your mother-in-law doesn't exactly strengthen a marriage. I kept my mouth shut for years, swallowing every insult, every slight, every cruel comment. I played the role of the understanding daughter-in-law who could take a joke, who didn't let things bother her. And Patricia kept pushing. This is where patience finally snapped. One afternoon, I came home early from work and heard my husband on the phone in his office. The door was slightly open, and I could hear his voice, tense and frustrated. I was about to knock and ask if everything was okay when I heard Patricia's voice coming through the speaker. He had her on speakerphone. She was telling him he should divorce me. Not suggesting. Telling. She said I was holding him back, that he deserved someone more suitable, someone who could give him the family he wanted. She said he was still young enough to start over, that cutting his losses now would be better than wasting more years. She laid out this whole argument for why ending our marriage was the logical choice, like she was presenting a business case. I stood there frozen, listening to my mother-in-law actively trying to destroy my marriage, and my husband, to his credit, was pushing back, telling her she was being ridiculous, that he loved me and wasn't going anywhere. But the fact that she felt comfortable even having this conversation, the fact that she thought this was an acceptable thing to say, made my blood boil. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Got the whole thing. Her laying out her case for why he should leave me, him defending our marriage, her insisting that he was making a mistake. When the call ended, I had everything I needed. I didn't confront my husband about it right away. He'd already defended me, already told his mother no, but I knew this wasn't going to stop. Patricia had been undermining me for years, and now she was actively working to end my marriage. She wasn't going to suddenly develop respect or boundaries. She needed to be dealt with. That weekend, there was a large family gathering. Patricia's birthday, actually. The whole extended family was there. Aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone gathered to celebrate the perfect matriarch. Patricia loved these events, loved being the center of attention, loved playing the role of the beloved family leader. She gave a speech about family values and staying close and supporting each other through everything. That's when everything unraveled. I waited until she finished her speech, waited until everyone was settled and relaxed. Then I stood up, said I had something I wanted to share, and played the recording. My husband's face went pale when he realized what I was doing, but I didn't stop. I let the whole room hear Patricia's voice telling her son to divorce me, calling me unsuitable, laying out her plan to break up our marriage. The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. People stared at Patricia like they'd never seen her before. Her face went from confusion to horror to rage in about 3 seconds. She tried to speak, tried to explain, but what explanation could possibly make that okay? The recording spoke for itself. Family members were horrified. Patricia's sisters looked mortified. Her own mother, my husband's grandmother, got up and left the room without saying a word. The perfect image Patricia had cultivated for decades, the loving mother and matriarch who only wanted what was best for everyone, shattered instantly. People started leaving. Some came up to me quietly and apologized for not seeing what was happening. Others just looked uncomfortable and made excuses to go. My husband was furious at first, angry that I'd ambushed his mother like that at a family event. But after the initial shock wore off, after he had time to really process what we'd all heard on that recording, he realized I'd only exposed what was already there. His mother had been manipulating him, manipulating all of us for years. He'd been making excuses for her behavior, writing it off as her being protective or old-fashioned. But hearing it played out loud in front of everyone made it impossible to deny. He cut contact with her shortly after, told her that until she could treat me with basic respect and stop trying to interfere in our marriage, he didn't want to hear from her. It wasn't an easy decision for him. That's his mother. But he finally saw her manipulation clearly, saw how toxic she'd been, and he chose our marriage. Patricia's now estranged from half the family. Turns out I wasn't the only person she'd been undermining and manipulating over the years. Once the facade cracked, other people started speaking up about their own experiences with her. Family members she'd pitted against each other, relatives she'd gossiped about, years of control and manipulation all coming to light. Her reputation never recovered. Some people think I went too far. They say I should have handled it privately. That humiliating her publicly was cruel, but I'd tried handling things privately for years. I'd swallowed every insult, ignored every slight, kept the peace while she actively worked to destroy my marriage. Playing that recording wasn't about revenge, it was about protection. She needed to know she couldn't keep operating in the shadows, that her actions had consequences. I don't regret it. Not for a second. Patricia spent years trying to destroy me, and in the end, she destroyed herself. But in-laws aren't the only ones who can play the long game with deception. Sometimes the person you trust most is living an entirely separate life. My girlfriend, Leah, and I had been together for 4 years. 4 years of building something I thought was real. Something with a future. We talked about marriage all the time, debated whether we wanted 2 kids or 3, spent weekends scrolling through real estate listings and fantasizing about which house would be ours. She seemed fully invested in everything we were planning. I had no reason to think otherwise, until I started noticing small things, little inconsistencies that didn't quite add up. She became secretive with her phone, angling it away from me when texts came in, taking calls in another room. She started making weekend trips to visit friends I'd never heard her mention before, friends from college she claimed she was reconnecting with. And she grew distant, not dramatically, just enough that I could feel the shift. Conversations that used to flow easily became surface level. Plans we'd been excited about suddenly seemed to make her uncomfortable. I trusted her, though. We'd been together for 4 years. You don't just throw away that kind of history over a feeling. So I ignored my gut, told myself I was being paranoid, convinced myself that maybe she was just stressed with work or going through something she wasn't ready to talk about yet. I gave her space and tried not to push. Looking back, I was an idiot for not seeing it sooner. One day, her laptop was open on the kitchen table. She'd run out to grab something from her car, and I walked past it on my way to make coffee. I wasn't trying to snoop. I genuinely wasn't. But the screen was facing me, and I saw an email chain about apartment viewings. The subject line caught my eye because it mentioned a city I'd never heard her talk about. A city in another state, hours away from where we lived. I stood there staring at it, confused, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why would she be looking at apartments somewhere else? We were planning to buy a house together here. We'd literally talked about it 2 weeks earlier. None of it made sense. So I clicked on the email. I know, invasion of privacy, but something told me I needed to see what was going on. And what I found made my stomach drop. She'd been corresponding with landlords for weeks, asking about lease terms, availability, move-in dates. There were emails about utility hookups, parking spaces, all the logistical details of someone planning a move. A permanent move. I kept scrolling, my hands shaking, looking for some explanation that would make this okay. Maybe it was a work thing. Maybe she was being transferred temporarily and hadn't told me yet. But then I found the job offer. An email congratulating her on accepting a position at a company across the country. A position she'd accepted months ago. Months. She'd been planning to leave for months and hadn't said a single word to me about it. We'd been talking about our future together while she was actively planning a future without me. And here's where it gets absurd. When Leah came back inside, I was still standing there with her laptop open in front of me. She saw what was on the screen and froze. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then I asked her point blank what was going on, my voice shaking. I wanted her to tell me I'd misunderstood, that there was some reasonable explanation for all of this. She didn't even try to lie. She just deflated, sat down at the table, and admitted everything. She'd gotten the job offer 4 months ago. She'd accepted it without telling me. She'd been planning the move, finding an apartment, arranging everything, and she was going to leave in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And she still hadn't planned to tell me. I asked her when she was going to let me know. Was she going to say something before she left? Or was I supposed to just wake up one day and find her gone? She couldn't even look at me. She said she didn't know, that she'd been trying to figure out how to tell me, but every time she thought about it, she couldn't go through with it. So she just kept putting it off. She admitted she'd outgrown the relationship, said she didn't feel the same way about me anymore, that she'd been feeling trapped for a while, that the idea of marriage and kids and settling down had started to feel suffocating instead of exciting. And instead of having an adult conversation about it, instead of being honest and giving me the chance to either work through it with her or end things cleanly, she decided the easier option was to just disappear. She was going to ghost me. After 4 years, she was literally planning to move across the country and start a new life without ever giving me closure or an explanation. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. 4 years of my life, all the plans we'd made, all the conversations about our future, and it had all meant nothing to her. She'd checked out months ago and just let me keep living in a fantasy while she planned her exit strategy. I ended it immediately, right there, that day. Told her to pack her things and leave. She tried to backtrack, said maybe we could talk about it, that she wasn't sure about the job anymore. But I was done. You don't come back from something like that. You don't secretly plan to abandon someone for months and then act like it's something you can just talk through. She moved out that week, took her stuff and left, and honestly, it felt like she couldn't get out fast enough. The apartment we'd shared felt hollow without her things there, but it was better than living with someone who'd already mentally checked out. What happened next? Nobody saw it coming. A few weeks after she left, after she'd already moved across the country and started her new job, she reached out, sent me this long email about how she'd made a mistake, how she'd panicked, how she didn't know what she was thinking. She said the new city felt lonely, that she missed what we had, that she wanted to talk about maybe trying again. I read the email once and deleted it. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. She didn't miss me. She missed the comfort and stability I'd provided while she figured out what she really wanted. And now that she was alone in a new place with no support system, she was suddenly rethinking her choices. But that wasn't my problem anymore. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the person you trust most is capable of the deepest betrayal. It's not always dramatic. It's not always an affair or some big explosive moment. Sometimes it's just cowardice. Someone who's too afraid to have hard conversations, too selfish to consider how their actions affect you, too checked out to care about the damage they leave behind. I deserved honesty. I deserved someone who would sit me down and have a difficult conversation instead of planning a secret exit. 4 years should have earned me at least that much. But Leah chose the easy way out, and I'm the one who had to deal with the aftermath. I'm doing better now. It took time to rebuild, to trust again, to stop wondering if the people close to me are secretly planning to disappear. But I got there, and I'm grateful in a weird way that I found out when I did. Better to discover it through an open laptop than to come home one day and find all her stuff gone with no explanation. At least she was planning to leave. Some people stick around while building entire relationships elsewhere. Our 5-year anniversary was approaching, and I wanted to do something special. Dan had been working so hard lately, always at the office, always stressed about some project or deadline. I figured surprising him with lunch would be a nice break in his day, a chance to celebrate us even though the actual anniversary was still a few days away. I'd never visited his office unannounced before. He always said it was chaotic and that he preferred keeping work and home separate, which I'd always respected. But this felt different. It was supposed to be romantic. I picked up food from his favorite Italian place, the one we'd gone to on our first date, and drove to his office building downtown. I was excited picturing his face when I walked in with lunch, maybe stealing a quick kiss before he had to get back to meetings. I felt like I was doing something sweet, something that would remind him why we worked as a couple. When I arrived at his floor and approached his assistant's desk, her reaction was immediate and strange. She looked panicked, her eyes going wide the second she saw me. She stood up quickly, almost knocking over her coffee, and tried to stall me. Said Dan was in a meeting, that he wasn't available, that maybe I should call first next time. But I could see into his office from where I was standing, and it was empty. I thanked her politely and said I'd just wait, started walking toward his door. She called after me, said he'd stepped out for lunch, that he wasn't there, but something about the way she said it felt off, too rushed, too nervous. So instead of waiting, I asked where he'd gone. She stammered, said she wasn't sure, maybe the cafe downstairs. I thanked her and headed for the elevator. The cafe was on the ground floor of the building, one of those corporate spots with overpriced sandwiches and mediocre coffee. I walked in, scanning the room for Dan, and that's when I saw him. He was at a corner table sitting across from a woman I didn't recognize. They were leaning in close, talking, and as I watched, he reached across the table and took her hand. My heart stopped. I stood there frozen, holding a bag of Italian food, watching my husband hold hands with another woman. For a second, I thought maybe I was misunderstanding. Maybe this was a work thing. Maybe they were just close colleagues and I was reading too much into it. But then I saw the way he was looking at her, the same way he used to look at me. I started walking toward their table. I don't even remember making the decision. My body just moved on autopilot. Dan saw me when I was about halfway across the cafe. The color drained from his face. He dropped her hand immediately and stood up, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find words that wouldn't come. The woman turned to see what he was staring at, and when she saw me, she looked confused. Not guilty, confused, like she had no idea who I was. That's when I knew. This wasn't some fleeting mistake. This was something else entirely. I didn't make a scene. I just looked at Dan and said we needed to talk, then turned and walked out. He followed me, of course, tried to grab my arm in the lobby, started stammering about how this wasn't what it looked like. I kept walking until we were outside, away from his co-workers and witnesses, and then I finally stopped and asked him who she was. He tried lying at first. Said she was a colleague, that they were just having a work lunch, that I was overreacting, but I'd seen the way they were sitting, the way he'd been holding her hand, the look on his face when he saw me. So I asked him again, and this time I told him not to insult my intelligence with another lie. And here's where it gets absurd. He broke. Admitted that her name was Michelle, that they worked together, and that they'd been seeing each other for over a year. A year. He'd been living a double life for 12 months, and I'd had no idea. All those business trips he'd been taking, the weekend conferences and client dinners, half of them had been romantic getaways with her. The late nights at the office that I'd assumed were about deadlines and projects. Dates. He'd been dating someone else while coming home to me every night. Kissing me goodnight, making plans for our future. I was the wife at home while she was his work wife turned actual affair partner. And apparently, Michelle had thought he was separated. He'd told her our marriage was basically over, that we were only still living together for financial reasons until the divorce went through. She had no idea he was still fully committed to our marriage on paper, still wearing his wedding ring, still celebrating anniversaries. The level of deception was staggering. He'd constructed an entire alternate reality where he got to have both relationships, where neither of us knew about the other, where he could play the devoted husband at home and the available boyfriend at work, and he'd maintained it for over a year without slipping up once. I left immediately, didn't go back inside, didn't say goodbye to his assistant, just got in my car and drove home. I called a lawyer from the parking lot of a grocery store where I'd pulled over because I couldn't stop shaking. Filed for divorce that same week. The next few days were a blur of going through everything. I logged into accounts I'd never bothered checking before, went through credit card statements, looked at his phone records. The evidence was everywhere once I knew what to look for. Hotel charges from cities he'd supposedly been visiting for work. Flowers purchased that I'd never received. Restaurant reservations for 2 on nights he'd told me he was working late. It was all there, a detailed record of his other life. Things went from bad to unhinged when I showed my lawyer everything I'd found. She said it was one of the most clear-cut cases of infidelity she'd handled, that the documentation was so thorough it was almost comical. Dan had essentially built his own evidence trail. Every romantic gesture he'd made for Michelle, every trip they'd taken, every lie he'd told, it was all documented in our joint finances. The divorce was brutal. Dan tried to claim we should split everything 50-50, that this was just a marriage that had run its course and we should be adults about it. I laughed in his face. My lawyer tore him apart in court. His affair wasn't just morally wrong, it was financially documented proof of him spending marital assets on his girlfriend. The judge was not sympathetic. I walked away with most of our assets. The house, the better car, a significant portion of his retirement accounts. He tried to fight it, but the evidence was overwhelming. Every dollar he'd spent on Michelle came out of his settlement. And Michelle, once she found out he'd been lying to her too, that he was still very much married and had no intention of leaving until I'd caught him, she ended it immediately. Apparently being the other woman is one thing when you think you're helping someone escape a dead marriage, but it's another thing entirely when you realize you're just part of an ongoing deception. Dan and Michelle's relationship didn't last 6 months after I left. Turns out a relationship built on lies and betrayal doesn't have a strong foundation. Who knew? It's been almost 2 years now. I'm in a better place, literally and figuratively. Got a promotion at work, bought new furniture for the house, started traveling again. Dan, from what I hear through mutual acquaintances, is miserable. Lost half his assets in the divorce, lost Michelle when the truth came out, and damaged his reputation at work when the affair became office gossip. Karma works fast when you give it that much material to work with. The worst part, looking back, isn't even the betrayal itself. It's realizing how long I was living in a fantasy while he was living in reality. I thought we were solid. I thought we were happy. I was planning our future while he was planning his exit strategy, and I never saw it coming until I walked into that cafe. But I'm grateful I found out when I did. Better 5 years than 15. Better before kids than after. Better while I still had time to rebuild than spending more years investing in something that was already dead. Double lives and hidden relationships seem almost common now, but what happens when you realize you were never even the main character in your own love story? I met Ryan online, one of those dating apps where you swipe through profiles and hope for the best. We matched, started talking, and the conversation just clicked immediately. He was charming, funny, seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. We texted constantly, moved to video calls within a week, and before I knew it, we were in a full-blown long-distance relationship. He lived about 6 hours away, which wasn't ideal, but we made it work. We'd visit each other when we could, alternating weekends, and it felt real. It felt like something worth investing in. After about a year of this back and forth, Ryan asked me to move to his city. He said he was tired of the distance, that he wanted us to actually build a life together instead of just visiting on weekends. It was a huge decision. I had a stable job, an apartment I loved, friends and family nearby. But I was in love, and the idea of finally being in the same place as him felt like the natural next step. So I did it. I quit my job, gave notice on my apartment, packed up my entire life, and relocated across the country to be with him. The first few weeks felt perfect. We were finally living in the same city, able to see each other whenever we wanted, doing normal couple things like grocery shopping and cooking dinner together. I was still job hunting, but I had some savings to hold me over, and Ryan was supportive. He helped me get settled, showed me around the city, introduced me to a few of his coworkers. Everything seemed to be falling into place exactly how we'd planned. Then, one night, about a month after I'd moved, a woman showed up at his door. I was in the living room when I heard the knocking, aggressive and insistent. Ryan's face went completely white when he looked through the peephole. He told me to go into the bedroom, said it was probably just a neighbor with a complaint or something, but the panic in his voice made it clear that wasn't true. I didn't go to the bedroom. I stayed right where I was. He opened the door and this woman immediately pushed past him into the apartment, furious, demanding to know who I was. She was shaking, her voice loud and raw with emotion. I just stood there frozen, trying to understand what was happening. Ryan tried to get her to calm down, kept saying they should talk outside. But she wasn't having it. She turned to me and asked me directly how long I'd been seeing Ryan. I told her about a year, that I'd just moved here to be with him. Her face crumpled. She said she'd been with him for 3 years. 3 years. They'd been together for 3 years, and I had no idea she existed. Turns out I was the side relationship he'd been hiding. She'd had no idea about me, and I'd had no idea about her. We were both standing in his apartment, two women who thought they were in committed, exclusive relationships with the same man, realizing we'd both been completely deceived. The room felt like it was spinning. I'd quit my job. I'd moved across the country. I'd uprooted my entire life for someone who'd been lying to me from day one. Ryan tried to explain, stumbling over his words, saying it wasn't what it looked like, that things were complicated, but there was no explanation that could make this okay. He'd been actively dating both of us, maintaining 2 full relationships, and somehow keeping us from ever finding out about each other. This is where patience finally snapped. The other woman, her name was Jenna, and I ended up sitting down with her that night after Ryan left the apartment. He tried to defend himself for a while, but eventually just gave up and walked out, leaving us both there to pick up the pieces. Jenna and I started comparing timelines, and it was sickening how well he'd orchestrated everything. Every time he told me he had to travel for work, he was actually with her. Every time he told her he was on a business trip, he was with me. He'd been using work as a cover to juggle 2 relationships in 2 different cities. We went through our phones, showed each other messages, photos, all the receipts of our relationships with him. The overlap was undeniable. There were weekends where he'd told me he couldn't visit because of a work deadline, and Jenna had photos of them together on those exact dates. Times when he'd cancelled plans with her last minute, and I had texts from him saying he'd just landed in my city. He'd been masterful about it, keeping track of lies, never slipping up in a way that exposed him. Until Jenna found a receipt in his car from a restaurant in my city. A restaurant he'd told her he'd never been to. She'd confronted him about it. He'd made up some excuse, but it made her suspicious enough to start digging. She'd found a few more inconsistencies, started asking around, and eventually tracked down enough information to figure out where he actually lived. That's how she ended up at his door that night. We decided right then and there that we were both done. Jenna had invested 3 years into this relationship. I'd moved my entire life, and he'd treated both of us like we were disposable, like our feelings and our futures didn't matter as long as he got what he wanted. We agreed to confront him together. When Ryan came back to the apartment the next morning, Jenna and I were both waiting for him. We laid out everything we'd discovered, every lie he'd told, every time he'd manipulated one of us to cover for the other. He didn't even try to deny it. He just sat there looking miserable, saying he was sorry, that he'd never meant for it to go this far, that he cared about both of us. Cared about both of us. Like that made it better. Like splitting your affection between two people who thought they were your only partner was some kind of compliment. We both dumped him on the spot, told him we were done, that he'd destroyed any trust or respect we'd ever had for him, and that he deserved to be alone. Jenna left first, and I started packing my things immediately after. I didn't have a lot since I'd only been there a month, but every item I put in a box felt like another piece of the life I'd tried to build crumbling apart. I moved back home within the week, crashed with a friend while I figured out my next steps, started job hunting again, tried to rebuild everything I'd given up. I was heartbroken and financially drained. The move had cost me most of my savings, and I was starting over from scratch in a city I'd been so eager to leave just a few months earlier. The whole experience was humiliating. I felt stupid for not seeing the red flags, for not questioning why he was always so busy, why he never wanted me to meet more of his friends, why certain parts of his life felt closed off. But he'd been careful. He'd covered his tracks well enough that neither Jenna nor I had any real reason to suspect anything until it all fell apart. I learned a painful lesson about trust and red flags, about how easy it is to miss warning signs when you want something to be real badly enough, about how some people are willing to lie and manipulate without a second thought if it serves them. Ryan wasn't some cartoon villain. He was just a selfish person who wanted to have his cake and eat it too. And he didn't care who got hurt in the process. Jenna and I stayed in touch for a while after. We'd text occasionally, check in on each other, bonded over the shared trauma of having been deceived by the same person. Eventually we drifted apart, but I'm grateful she showed up that night. If she hadn't, I might have wasted even more time on someone who was never going to be honest with me. It's been over a year now, and I'm doing better. I found a new job, rebuilt my savings, started dating again, but with a much healthier sense of skepticism. I don't regret moving for love. I regret moving for someone who didn't deserve it, but that's on him, not me. Being deceived in love is one thing, but imagine finding proof that the apology you accepted was built on yet another lie. I caught my fiancé, Alex, cheating 6 months before our wedding. I'd had a feeling something was off for weeks, the usual signs you hear about but never think will happen to you. He was distant, always on his phone, working late more than usual. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, that wedding stress was making me see problems that weren't there. But then I found the messages. I wasn't even snooping. His phone was sitting on the counter while he was in the shower, and a notification popped up that made my stomach drop. I read through enough to confirm what I'd been afraid of. He'd been seeing someone from his gym, a woman named Claire. The messages weren't just flirty, they were explicit. Plans to meet up, inside jokes, the kind of familiarity that only comes from spending real time together. When Alex got out of the shower, I was sitting on the couch with his phone in my hand. He knew immediately that I'd seen everything. He broke down completely. Tears, apologies, the whole performance. He swore it was a one-time mistake, that it had only been going on for a few weeks, that it meant nothing, and he'd been trying to figure out how to end it. He begged me for forgiveness, said he couldn't lose me, that he'd do anything to make it right. He promised to cut all contact with Claire, to block her number, to never see her again. I was devastated. We'd been together for 4 years, engaged for 8 months. We had a venue booked, invitations printed, a whole future planned, and now I was sitting there trying to decide if I could forgive this, if our relationship was salvageable, or if I needed to walk away from everything we'd built. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that people make mistakes, that relationships can survive infidelity if both people are willing to work at it. So I agreed to try. I told him we needed couples therapy, that the wedding was postponed until I felt like I could trust him again, and that if I found out he'd lied about anything or had any contact with Claire, we were done. No second chances. He agreed to everything. We started therapy the following week. For months he seemed genuinely remorseful. He was more attentive than he'd been in years, constantly checking in with me, being transparent about where he was and what he was doing. He showed me his phone whenever I asked, gave me passwords to his accounts, did everything he could to prove he was serious about rebuilding trust. Slowly, I started to feel like maybe we could get through this. Maybe this was just a rough patch that would make us stronger in the long run. We rescheduled the wedding for 6 months later, giving ourselves time to heal and rebuild before making that commitment. As the new date approached, I started to feel cautiously optimistic. We'd done the work, we'd gotten through the hardest part. Maybe we were actually going to be okay. Then, 2 weeks before our rescheduled wedding, a mutual friend sent me screenshots. Alex had never stopped seeing Claire, he'd just gotten better at hiding it. The screenshots our friend sent were recent messages from just days earlier. Photos they'd taken together, plans they'd made for the weekend, inside jokes about how careful they had to be now that I was watching him more closely. He'd been playing me for months, going through the motions of couples therapy and reconciliation while continuing the affair the entire time. I felt like the world's biggest idiot. I believed every word. I'd put in the work, gone to therapy, opened myself up to trusting him again, and the whole time he'd been laughing behind my back with the same woman he'd promised to cut contact with. The screenshots included details that made it even worse. Messages where he complained about how exhausting it was to keep up the remorseful act, how annoying therapy was, how he just needed to get through the wedding and then things would calm down and they could be more open about seeing each other. He'd been planning to marry me while fully intending to keep the affair going. I called him immediately, didn't even wait to calm down or think through what I wanted to say. Just called and asked him point blank if he was still seeing Claire. He tried to deny it at first, said our friend was stirring up drama, that the screenshots were old or taken out of context. I told him I had dates and timestamps, that I could see they were from this week, and asked him again if he was still seeing her. He finally admitted it, said he'd tried to end it but couldn't, that he had feelings for both of us, that he didn't know what to do. Like this was some tragic love triangle, and not just him being a selfish liar who wanted to have everything without consequences. That's when everything unraveled. I cancelled the wedding that same day, called the venue, the caterer, everyone we'd hired, sent a message to our guest list explaining that the wedding was off due to circumstances beyond my control. I didn't go into details publicly at first, just said we'd decided not to move forward with the marriage. Then I returned the ring, drove to his apartment while he was at work, left it on the kitchen counter with a note that said we were done and he should have all his things out of my place by the end of the week. I didn't want to see him, didn't want to hear more apologies or excuses. I was finished. But Alex wasn't ready to let his reputation take the hit. He started telling people his version of events, painting himself as someone who'd made a mistake and was trying to fix things, and me as someone who was unforgiving and unwilling to work through problems. He told mutual friends that I'd overreacted, that the screenshots were misleading, that he and Claire were just friends and I was being controlling. So I exposed everything. I sent the screenshots to our families and close friends, the full conversation history showing exactly what had been going on and for how long. His parents were horrified. My family was furious on my behalf. Friends who'd been on the fence about whose story to believe saw the evidence, and there was no question anymore about what had really happened. Alex tried to salvage things, tried to claim the screenshots were edited, or that I'd somehow manipulated the evidence. But it didn't work. Too many people had seen the truth. His carefully constructed narrative fell apart, and suddenly he was the one dealing with the social fallout of his choices. I walked away and rebuilt my life. It wasn't easy. I'd lost deposits on the wedding, wasted months in therapy, trying to fix something that was never going to work. Invested emotional energy into someone who didn't deserve it. But I got through it, leaned on friends and family, threw myself into work, started therapy on my own to process everything. A year later, I'm engaged to someone who actually respects me, someone who doesn't make me question whether I'm being paranoid when I notice changes in behavior, someone who's honest and transparent and treats our relationship like something valuable instead of something to manage around his other priorities. The difference is night and day. Looking back, I'm grateful I found out when I did. Better 2 weeks before the wedding than 2 years into a marriage. Better with screenshots as proof than with just a nagging feeling I could never confirm. Alex showed me exactly who he was, and I'm glad I finally believed him. Affairs at home are devastating, but betrayal at work, that's a whole different level of calculated cruelty. I worked under my boss, Greg, for 6 years. 6 years of putting in extra hours, taking on projects no one else wanted, being the person he could count on when things got chaotic. And Greg never hesitated to remind me how valuable I was. He'd constantly praise my dedication and loyalty, tell other people in meetings that I was indispensable, promise me that promotions were just around the corner. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? I'd given that company 6 years of my life, and Greg had been nothing but supportive the entire time. Then the company launched a major project, one of the biggest contracts we'd ever landed. It was a huge deal, something that could really put us on the map if we executed it well. Greg was the lead on it, responsible for managing the budget and timeline, and I was assigned to support him. I handled a lot of the coordination, kept track of deliverables, made sure teams were communicating. It was intense, but I was excited to be part of something so significant. A few months into the project, I started noticing that we were burning through the budget faster than expected. I mentioned it to Greg a couple of times, flagged some of the larger expenses that seemed out of line with what we'd originally planned. He brushed it off, said everything was under control, that he'd accounted for it. I trusted him. He was the one with the executive access, the one who'd been doing this for years. If he said it was fine, I figured it was fine. Turns out it wasn't fine. Greg had made a critical error in budget allocation. He'd overspent by nearly $200,000, approved expenditures that weren't in the original plan, shifted money around without proper authorization, made decisions that ballooned costs in ways that couldn't be justified. And when the executives started asking questions, started pulling reports and wanting to know why we were so far over budget, Greg panicked. He called me into his office on a Friday afternoon. I thought maybe he wanted to go over our strategy for the executive meeting, figure out how to explain the overages and get things back on track. Instead, he told me he was restructuring the team and that my position was being eliminated. Just like that. 6 years of loyalty, and I was being let go. I was blindsided. I asked him why, what I'd done wrong, if there was any way to fix whatever the issue was. He gave me some corporate speak about changing priorities and budget constraints, said it wasn't personal, that these decisions were never easy. He wouldn't look me in the eye. I left his office in a daze, packed up my desk, and went home trying to process what had just happened. But that wasn't even the worst part. Days later, I got a call from a former coworker, someone I'd been friendly with who still worked there. She told me she'd seen internal memos that Greg had written, memos blaming me for the budget disaster. He'd fabricated emails, doctored communication chains to make it look like I'd been the one making the financial decisions that led to the overages. He'd created an entire paper trail pointing to me as the person responsible, and he'd used that to justify firing me. I wasn't being let go because of budget constraints or restructuring. I was being fired to protect him from the consequences of his own mistakes. I felt sick. 6 years. 6 years of dedication, of staying late and coming in early, of defending him in meetings and covering for his disorganization. And this was how he repaid me, by throwing me under the bus to save his own career. I was furious, not just hurt, not just disappointed, but absolutely livid. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. So I started gathering evidence. Every legitimate email I'd ever sent about the project, every report I'd filed, every record I had that showed the actual chain of decision-making. I went through my personal email archives, my saved documents, everything, and the evidence was clear. Every major budget decision had been approved by Greg. Every expenditure I'd flagged as potentially problematic, he'd overruled. The paper trail showed exactly who was responsible, and it wasn't me. I compiled everything into a detailed report, organized chronologically, with clear documentation of who made what decisions and when. Then I sent it to HR and copied the executives who were investigating the budget issues. I didn't editorialize, didn't add emotional commentary. I just presented the facts and let the evidence speak for itself. Then came the breaking point for Greg. An investigation was launched immediately. HR brought in an external auditor to review the project finances and the personnel decisions surrounding my termination. They interviewed other team members, pulled server logs of emails that Greg thought he'd deleted, cross-referenced everything against the fabricated documents he'd created. And it all fell apart for him. The timeline didn't match. The email headers on his doctored communications showed they'd been created after the fact. People who'd been in meetings contradicted the version of events he'd presented. It took about 3 weeks for the full scope of what he'd done to come to light. Greg had not only mismanaged the budget and blamed me, but he'd also actively falsified company records to cover it up. That crossed a line from bad management into something the company's legal team got very concerned about very quickly. Greg was demoted within a month, stripped of his management position, moved to a role with no direct reports and significantly less authority. His reputation in the company was destroyed. People who'd worked with him for years suddenly saw him differently, realized that if he was willing to do this to me, he might be willing to do it to anyone. The trust was gone. He eventually resigned a few months later. I heard through the grapevine that he couldn't handle the humiliation, couldn't stand being in an office where everyone knew what he'd done. He tried to spin it as pursuing other opportunities, but everyone knew the truth. The company offered me my job back, full reinstatement, back pay for the time I'd been terminated, even a raise and the promotion Greg had been promising me for years. The executives apologized, said they should have done more due diligence before approving my termination, that they valued my contributions and wanted me back on the team. I declined. By that point, I'd already started interviewing elsewhere, and I'd found better opportunities, companies that actually valued transparency and accountability, places where I wouldn't have to worry about a manager fabricating evidence to cover their mistakes. The back pay was nice, and I appreciated the acknowledgement that I'd been wronged, but I wasn't interested in going back to a place that had let this happen in the first place. The whole experience taught me that loyalty to a company or a boss is only valuable if it's reciprocal. I'd given Greg 6 years of my best work, and the moment it became convenient, he sacrificed me without hesitation. He'd praised my dedication right up until the second he needed a scapegoat, and if the company had been willing to fire me based solely on his word, without investigating, what did that say about how much they actually valued me? I'm in a much better place now. Better job, better leadership, better work culture, and I learned to document everything. Every decision, every conversation, every assignment. Not because I expect to be betrayed again, but because I'm never going to be in a position where someone can rewrite history and make me the villain in their story. Greg lost his career over his own mistakes and his decision to compound them with lies. I lost a job I thought I'd keep for years, but I gained something more valuable, the knowledge that I'd rather start over with my integrity intact than stay somewhere that doesn't deserve my loyalty. Bosses protecting themselves is bad enough, but co-workers actively sabotaging you, that's a special kind of workplace evil. I was leading a high-stakes client presentation, one of those make-or-break meetings that could either land us a 6-figure contract or lose a relationship we'd been building for months. I'd been preparing for weeks, coordinating with multiple departments, running through the deck dozens of times to make sure everything was perfect. This wasn't just important for the company, it was important for me. Landing this client would have been a major win for my career, proof that I could handle the big accounts. The morning of the presentation, I got to the office early, did one final run-through of the slides, confirmed that everything was exactly where it needed to be. Data charts, case studies, testimonials, the pricing breakdown, all of it was polished and ready. I felt confident. Maybe the most confident I'd felt about a presentation in my entire career. Then the client arrived and everything went wrong. I opened the presentation file in the conference room and immediately I could tell something was off. Slides were missing. Entire sections I'd built out were just gone. The data on the charts that were still there was incorrect, showing numbers that made no sense and contradicted points I was trying to make. I stood there frozen, clicking through the deck in front of the client and my manager, watching my carefully prepared presentation fall apart in real time. I tried to recover, tried to talk through the missing sections from memory, but it was a disaster. The client could see I was unprepared, that the materials didn't match what I'd promised in our previous conversations. They kept asking questions I couldn't answer because the supporting slides weren't there. After about 20 minutes of me stumbling through an explanation, they stood up and said they needed to reconsider whether we were the right fit for their needs. They walked out. My manager was furious. He didn't wait until we were alone. He blamed me right there in the conference room, in front of the other team members who sat in on the presentation. Asked me how I could possibly have been so careless, said this was completely unacceptable, that I'd embarrassed the company and potentially cost us a major client. I tried to explain that something had happened to the file, that it wasn't like this when I'd checked it that morning, but he wasn't interested in excuses. I was humiliated. I went back to my desk feeling sick, my face burning with shame. I knew I'd triple-checked everything the night before. I knew those slides had been perfect. Something had happened between my final review and the meeting, and I needed to figure out what. So I started digging into the shared drive's version history. Our company used a system that tracked every change made to files, who made them, and when. I pulled up the logs for the presentation file and started scrolling through the timestamps, and there it was. My coworker, Jenna, had accessed the presentation file 1 hour before the meeting. She'd deleted key slides, altered data in the charts, removed entire sections of content. The version history showed exactly what she'd changed and when. She'd sabotaged me deliberately, methodically, right before the most important presentation of my career. My hands were shaking as I kept digging, looking back through months of file histories on other projects, and I found a pattern. Jenna had been doing this for a while, small changes here and there on my work, nothing dramatic enough to be obvious, but enough to make me look careless or sloppy. A typo inserted into a report, a deadline changed in a shared calendar, contact information altered in a client database. She'd been sabotaging me for months, hoping to make me look incompetent so she could take over my projects and accounts. I was livid. This wasn't professional competition or someone trying to get ahead through their own merit. This was active, calculated sabotage. She'd been undermining my work, damaging my reputation, and jeopardizing my career. All so she could position herself as the better option when my projects inevitably failed. I spent the rest of that day compiling evidence, screenshots of the version history, timestamps showing exactly when she'd accessed my files, side-by-side comparisons of the original content and what she'd changed it to. I organized everything chronologically, built a clear timeline of her interference across multiple projects. By the time I was done, the evidence was irrefutable. The next team meeting was 3 days later. It was our regular weekly check-in, the whole department gathered in the main conference room to review ongoing projects and discuss priorities. I waited until we got to the section where people could bring up concerns or issues. Then I calmly asked if I could share something with the group. I pulled up my laptop, connected it to the projector, and presented the evidence. Timestamps showing Jenna accessing my files, version histories showing exactly what she'd deleted and altered, the pattern of sabotage across months of work. I walked through it methodically, letting the data speak for itself. No emotion, no accusations beyond what the logs clearly showed. Just facts. The room went completely silent. Everyone was staring at the screen, then at Jenna, then back at the screen. Jenna's face went pale, then red, then pale again. She tried to deny it at first, stammered something about how the timestamps must be wrong, that she'd maybe opened the files accidentally, but hadn't changed anything. But the version history showed exactly what had been deleted and modified. There was no talking her way out of it. My manager, the same one who'd humiliated me in front of the client 3 days earlier, looked absolutely stunned. He asked Jenna directly if she had anything to say to explain this. She couldn't. She just sat there, her mouth opening and closing, no words coming out. This is where patience finally snapped for management. Jenna was escorted out of the meeting by HR within 15 minutes. They didn't even wait to finish the team discussion. Just pulled her aside and she was gone. I found out later that day she'd been fired on the spot. The company took sabotage seriously, especially when it was documented as thoroughly as what I'd presented. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. She deliberately damaged company projects and undermined a colleague. That was grounds for immediate termination. My manager apologized to me privately that afternoon. He said he should have listened when I tried to explain what had happened with the presentation, that he'd been too quick to blame me without investigating. He reassured me that my job was secure and that I'd be given Jenna's accounts to manage going forward. Some of them were major clients she'd been angling for, accounts that would have been career-defining for her. Now, they were mine. I reached back out to the client from the failed presentation, explained what had happened, and provided them with the corrected materials. They appreciated the transparency and agreed to reschedule. We ended up landing the contract 2 weeks later. Jenna's career in our industry is effectively over. Word spread fast about why she'd been fired. Our field is smaller than people think. And reputation matters. The kind of deliberate sabotage she'd engaged in isn't something companies are willing to overlook. Last I heard, she'd moved to a different city and was working in an entirely different industry. I don't feel bad about how it played out. She made calculated choices to destroy my work and damage my reputation. She had every opportunity to succeed on her own merit, to compete fairly, to build her own achievements. Instead, she chose to tear me down, and when the evidence of what she'd done was laid out in front of everyone, she faced the consequences. The whole experience taught me to document everything and to trust my instincts when something feels off. I knew that presentation had been perfect. I knew I hadn't made those mistakes, and instead of just accepting the blame and moving on, I dug deeper and found the truth. Sabotage is one thing, but training someone to replace you without even knowing it, that's a betrayal that hits differently. My manager asked me to train a new hire, Sophie, saying she was joining the team to help with overflow work. We'd been growing steadily, taking on more clients than our current staff could comfortably handle, so it made sense that they'd bring someone else on board. I was actually excited about it. I'd never had the chance to mentor someone before, and the idea of having another set of hands to help manage the workload sounded like a relief. I spent months teaching Sophie everything I knew: client accounts, internal systems, industry contacts, the shortcuts and workarounds I'd developed over years of doing this job. She shadowed me constantly, sat in on my calls, watched how I handled difficult clients and navigated office politics. I walked her through every process, introduced her to key people in our network, gave her access to resources I'd built up over my entire tenure at the company. She was eager to learn, asked good questions, took detailed notes. I thought I was being a good colleague, helping someone get up to speed so we could both be more effective. Then, one Friday afternoon, I was called into HR. No warning, no context, just a message asking me to come down to their office at the end of the day. I figured it was probably some routine paperwork, or maybe a discussion about the upcoming performance review cycle. I wasn't worried. I should have been worried. They told me my position was being eliminated due to restructuring, budget cuts, shifting priorities, the usual corporate language that basically means they decided you're expendable. I was being let go, effective immediately. They handed me a severance package, 2 weeks' pay, and walked me through the exit process like they were reading from a script. I sat there in complete shock, trying to process what was happening. I'd been with the company for 4 years. My performance reviews had always been strong. I'd just successfully onboarded a new team member. Nothing about this made sense. I asked them why. What had changed, if there was anything I could have done differently. They gave me vague answers about company direction and difficult decisions. I was too stunned to push back. I just signed the paperwork, packed up my desk, and left. The following Monday, I got a message from a former coworker. Sophie had been announced as my replacement, not as an additional team member to help with overflow, as my replacement, in my role, with my title, handling my accounts. The position hadn't been eliminated at all. They'd just eliminated me and given everything I'd built to someone they could pay less. I'd trained her to take my job without knowing it. Every client relationship I'd introduced her to, every system I'd taught her to navigate, every contact I'd connected her with, I'd been handing over the keys to my own career. And management had orchestrated the whole thing, using me to make their cost-cutting transition as smooth as possible. I felt humiliated and betrayed, not just by the company, but by the situation they put me in. They'd made me complicit in my own replacement, had me spend months enthusiastically training someone to do my job, all while knowing they were going to fire me the second she was ready. The 2 week severance felt like an insult, considering I'd just given them months of unpaid training labor. But that wasn't even the worst part. I started reaching out to my professional network, putting feelers out for new opportunities, letting people know I was looking. And in those conversations, I kept hearing the same thing. My former company had a pattern of doing this. Multiple people told me stories about colleagues who'd been let go right after training new hires, about restructuring that always seemed to coincide with bringing on cheaper replacements, about a culture of using experienced employees to onboard their own less expensive successors. It wasn't just me. This was a deliberate strategy. Hire someone junior at a lower salary, have your experienced person train them for a few months, then cut the experienced person loose once the new hire can function independently. Save money on salary, maintain operational continuity, and the experienced employee does all the knowledge transfer work for free before they even know they're being replaced. I was livid, not just about what had happened to me, but about the fact that this was standard practice and they were getting away with it because most people just took their severance and left quietly. So I didn't leave quietly. I wrote a detailed professional review on Glassdoor outlining exactly what had happened. I didn't name names, didn't make emotional accusations, just laid out the facts of the practice and how it had played out in my case. I described the pattern of using experienced employees to train their replacements without disclosure, the timing of terminations, the misleading framing of new hires as additional help rather than replacements. Within days, other former employees started corroborating my story. People I'd never even met were adding their own experiences, describing nearly identical situations. The review section for the company became a documentation of this pattern, a public record that potential employees and clients could see. The company's reputation took a visible hit. Their ratings dropped, and according to people still working there, HR started getting questions about it in interviews. I found a better job within a month, a company that actually valued experience, that didn't view their employees as disposable training resources. Better pay, better culture, better growth opportunities. Leaving that toxic environment ended up being the best thing that could have happened to my career, even if it didn't feel that way in the moment. Sophie? She lasted 6 months before burning out. Turns out that doing a job that took someone 4 years to master is actually pretty difficult when you've only had a few months of training and no real experience. She was overwhelmed, clients were unhappy with the transition, and she ended up leaving for something less demanding. The company had to hire someone else and start the whole cycle over again. The whole experience taught me that loyalty to a company is only worth something if it's reciprocal. I'd given them 4 years of solid work, successfully managed major accounts, trained my own replacement with enthusiasm, and they discarded me the second it was financially convenient. They didn't value my contribution, they valued the cost savings of replacing me with someone cheaper. I learned to be more cautious about what I share and with whom, to pay attention to patterns in how companies treat their employees, to trust my instincts when something feels off, and to never assume that doing good work and being a team player will protect you from being treated as a line item on a budget spreadsheet. I don't regret speaking up about what happened. Companies like that thrive on people leaving quietly, on former employees being too professional or too afraid to share their experiences publicly. By documenting the pattern, by adding my voice to others who'd been through the same thing, I helped create accountability that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Corporate betrayal stings, but sometimes it's not about losing your job. It's about being labeled something false when you refuse to compromise your integrity. I worked in accounting for a mid-sized company, the kind of place that looked good on paper, but had some questionable practices once you got beneath the surface. I'd been there for about 3 years, kept my head down, did my job well, had no issues with anyone. Then one day my supervisor called me into his office and asked me to backdate some invoices. Said we needed to manipulate the quarterly earnings to make the numbers look better for an upcoming investor report. I sat there for a second, making sure I'd heard him correctly. He wanted me to falsify financial documents, to commit fraud, and he was saying it casually, like he was asking me to file some paperwork or schedule a meeting. I refused, told him straight up that what he was asking me to do was illegal, that it could result in serious consequences for the company and personally for me. I could lose my CPA license, I could face criminal charges. This wasn't some grey area or creative accounting. This was fraud. He didn't like that answer, started pushing back saying everyone does it, that this was standard practice in the industry, that I was overthinking it. He made it sound like I was being naive, like I didn't understand how business really worked. But I understood perfectly. He was asking me to break the law, and I wasn't going to do it. I stood firm, told him I couldn't and wouldn't backdate those invoices, and that if the company needed better numbers, we should focus on actual performance improvements, not fabricated documentation. He got irritated, said I was being difficult, but eventually dismissed me from his office. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, that he'd find someone else to do his dirty work or just drop the idea entirely. I was wrong. Within weeks, I was written up for insubordination. My supervisor filed a formal complaint saying I'd refused to follow direct instructions and had been argumentative in meetings. Then came another write-up for poor attitude, claiming I was creating a negative work environment and wasn't being a team player. HR called me in and told me I was being placed on a performance improvement plan. They said multiple people had complained about me being difficult to work with, that I needed to adjust my attitude and be more cooperative. I knew exactly what was happening. This was retaliation. I'd refused to break the law, and now they were building a paper trail to justify firing me. The performance improvement plan was designed to make me quit or give them enough documented reasons to terminate me without it looking like retaliation for whistleblowing. The thing is, I'd been documenting everything from the moment my supervisor first asked me to backdate those invoices. I had the date, time, what he'd asked me to do, my refusal, everything. I'd been keeping detailed notes of every interaction since then, every write-up, every meeting with HR. I knew this might get ugly, and I wanted to be prepared. I consulted an employment lawyer, explained the situation, showed them my documentation. They told me I had a strong case and that what the company was doing was textbook retaliation against a whistleblower. They advised me to file a complaint with the SEC and report the company's fraudulent accounting practices. So that's what I did. And here's where it gets absurd. I filed a detailed whistleblower complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission, provided all my documentation, outlined exactly what my supervisor had asked me to do, and how the company had retaliated when I refused. The SEC took it seriously. They launched an investigation, started pulling records, interviewing people, digging into the company's financial practices. Turns out the backdated invoices my supervisor wanted me to handle weren't an isolated incident. This had been going on for years. Multiple departments were manipulating numbers to inflate earnings reports, mislead investors, and secure better financing terms. The scope of the fraud was way bigger than I'd realized. My refusal to participate had apparently made my supervisor nervous that I might expose the whole operation, which is why he'd moved so quickly to discredit me. The investigation took several months, but the findings were damning. My supervisor was fired immediately once the extent of his involvement became clear. Several other executives were let go as well. The company faced hefty fines from the SEC, had to restate years of financial reports, and took a massive hit to their reputation. Investors pulled out, stock prices dropped, the whole thing became a mess. During all of this, I was still technically employed, still on my performance improvement plan, still dealing with HR treating me like I was the problem. But once the SEC investigation went public, the company's attitude toward me changed real fast. Suddenly, I wasn't difficult or insubordinate. Suddenly, I was a valued employee who they hoped would stay on through this transitional period. They offered me a settlement, a significant raise, a promotion, assurances that the performance improvement plan would be removed from my record, a glowing letter of recommendation, whatever I wanted if I'd just stay and help rebuild trust. They were terrified I'd sue them for retaliation, and they should have been. My lawyer said we had an airtight case, but I didn't want their settlement. I didn't want to stay at a company that had tried to destroy my career because I refused to commit fraud. I didn't want to work with people who valued short-term financial manipulation over basic ethics and legal compliance, so I left. I gave my notice, worked my final 2 weeks, and walked out with my head high and my reputation intact. In fact, my reputation in the industry was better than ever. Word got around about what had happened, about how I'd refused to participate in fraud and stood my ground even when the company retaliated. Other firms reached out, impressed that I'd prioritized integrity over keeping my job. I found a new position within a month at a company that actually values ethics and compliance, a place where when I raise concerns about questionable practices, people listen instead of trying to silence me. The difference is night and day. Looking back, I don't regret a single decision I made. Refusing to backdate those invoices was the right call, legally, ethically, and professionally. Standing up to the retaliation was terrifying, but necessary. Filing the whistleblower complaint exposed practices that needed to be stopped. Could I have just gone along with it? Sure. Could I have kept my head down, backdated the invoices, kept collecting a paycheck, and pretended I didn't know I was participating in fraud? Absolutely. But then I'd have been complicit. I'd have been liable if the whole thing eventually came to light some other way. And I'd have had to live with knowing I'd compromised my principles to protect a company that didn't deserve protection. The experience taught me that doing the right thing often comes with a cost, but the cost of doing the wrong thing is always higher in the long run. My former supervisor thought he could pressure me into compliance and then retaliate when I refused. Instead, he ended his own career and brought down a fraud scheme that had been operating for years. I have zero regrets. My career is better, my conscience is clear, and I sleep well at night, knowing I stood up for what was right, even when it would have been easier to look the other way. Refusing to break the law is one form of integrity, but what happens when standing up for what's right means uncovering where your hard-earned money actually went? I'd been promised a raise for months. Every time I brought it up with my manager, he'd give me the same answer. It's in the works. Be patient. These things take time. Budget approvals are slow. I wanted to believe him. I'd been with the company for 3 years, consistently exceeding my performance targets, taking on extra responsibilities that weren't in my job description, working overtime without complaint. I'd earned that raise, and he knew it. So I waited. I kept doing the work, kept going above and beyond, kept trusting that my manager was advocating for me the way he said he was. I'd check in every few weeks, and he'd reassure me that it was still moving through the approval process, that I just needed to hang on a little longer. Then one day, budget reports were accidentally sent to the entire team. Someone in finance had meant to send them only to department heads, but clicked the wrong distribution list. Suddenly, everyone had access to quarterly budget allocations, salary adjustments, and bonus distributions. Most people probably just glanced at it and deleted it. But I read through the whole thing carefully, and that's when I saw it. A significant bonus had been allocated to my manager. The amount was almost exactly what my raise would have cost over the course of a year. I sat there staring at my screen, doing the math over and over, hoping I was wrong. But the numbers didn't lie. The money that should have gone to my salary increase had instead been funneled into his bonus. I was furious, not just disappointed or frustrated, but genuinely angry in a way I rarely get at work. He'd been stringing me along for months, telling me to be patient while he redirected the funds meant for my raise into his own pocket. And he'd done it while I was working extra hours and taking on additional projects, all based on the promise that my compensation would reflect my contributions. I didn't confront him directly. I knew that would go nowhere. Instead, I scheduled a meeting with HR and came prepared. I brought printouts of the budget report, highlighted the relevant sections, and laid out a timeline of every conversation I'd had with my manager about my raise. I showed them the dates I'd been promised it was being processed, the metrics I'd exceeded, the additional responsibilities I'd taken on, and then the budget allocation showing where the money had actually gone. The HR representative looked uncomfortable, started talking about how budget decisions are complex, that there might be factors I wasn't aware of, that this could all be a miscommunication. I didn't let them brush it off. I pointed out that my manager had specifically told me multiple times that my raise was being processed. And now I had documentation showing that funds had been available but redirected to his bonus instead. I made it clear that I considered this a serious breach of trust, and that if it wasn't resolved, I'd be escalating to senior leadership and potentially seeking legal counsel for what looked a lot like wage theft through deception. That got their attention. Within days, my raise was approved. Not just approved, but made retroactive to when it had originally been promised. They framed it as the paperwork finally going through, as if the timing was just a coincidence. But I knew what had happened. They'd realized I had documentation of promises made and funds misallocated, and they didn't want the liability. But the trust was broken, completely shattered. I'd spent months believing my manager was advocating for me, that he valued my work, that the delay was just bureaucratic slowness. Now I knew he'd been lying to my face while profiting from funds that should have been mine. And the company had only fixed it when I'd threatened to make it a bigger problem. I started job hunting that same week, updated my resume, reached out to my network, started applying to positions that offered better pay and, more importantly, better leadership. I wasn't going to stay at a company where I had to fight this hard just to get what I'd already earned. Things went from bad to unhinged when I got an offer. It came from a competitor, a company I'd admired for years. Better salary than even my newly approved raise, better benefits, actual growth opportunities, and a management structure that valued transparency. I accepted immediately and then scheduled a meeting with my manager to submit my resignation. When I told him I was leaving, he tried to guilt me, said I was abandoning the team, that we were in the middle of important projects, that he'd invested so much in my development, and this was how I was repaying him. He acted hurt, like I was being disloyal. I let him finish his speech, Then I reminded him, very calmly, that he'd stolen my raise to pad his own bonus, that he'd lied to me for months while I worked overtime and took on extra responsibilities based on promises he had no intention of keeping, that the only reason I'd eventually gotten my raise was because I'd found proof of what he'd done and threatened to escalate. I told him that trust is a two-way street, and he'd destroyed any trust I had in him the moment he chose his bonus over my promised compensation, that I didn't owe loyalty to someone who'd proven they had none for me. He didn't have anything to say to that, just sat there looking uncomfortable, probably realizing that his guilt trip wasn't going to work on someone who had receipts. I finished out my 2 weeks, keeping things professional but distant. I documented my ongoing projects, did proper handoffs, and made sure nothing would fall through the cracks after I left. My last day, a few co-workers took me out for lunch. Some of them had figured out what had happened with the budget reports, and they told me they respected how I'd handled it. A couple of them admitted they'd had similar experiences with delayed raises and promises that never materialized. It made me wonder how many other people had been strung along the same way. I left without looking back. My new job has been everything I hoped it would be. Leadership that's transparent about compensation, managers who actually advocate for their teams, a culture where exceeding expectations leads to recognition and reward rather than just more work. The difference is staggering. Looking back, I'm almost grateful for that accidental email. If finance hadn't sent those budget reports to the whole team, I might never have known where my raise actually went. I might have kept believing my manager's excuses, kept working extra hours, kept waiting patiently for something that was never coming. The experience taught me that trust in the workplace has to be earned and maintained, and that when someone shows you they're willing to lie for personal gain, you should believe them. My manager had a choice between advocating for his team member and padding his own bonus. He chose himself and then lied about it for months. That told me everything I needed to know about his character and about the kind of company that would allow that behavior. I don't regret pushing back with HR, and I don't regret leaving. Some people might think I should have been grateful they eventually approved my raise, that I got what I wanted, so why make a big deal about it? But it's not just about the money. It's about being valued, being treated honestly, working for people who see you as more than just a resource to exploit. Money being redirected is frustrating, but when someone systematically turns an entire group against you, that's psychological warfare. I noticed my friend group growing distant over the course of a few months. It wasn't dramatic at first, just small things that I tried to convince myself didn't mean anything. Invitations to hang out stopped coming. When I'd suggest getting together, people suddenly had other plans or were too busy. The group chats I'd been active in for years would go quiet the second I posted something, like everyone was waiting for me to leave before continuing the conversation. People started making excuses to avoid me, cancelling plans last minute, being vague about what they were up to on weekends. I was confused and hurt. I kept replaying interactions in my head, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. Had I said something offensive without realizing it? Had I missed some major event and people were mad I hadn't shown up? I couldn't pinpoint anything that would explain why my entire friend group seemed to be icing me out. It got to the point where I was barely sleeping, anxiety eating away at me every time I checked my phone and saw the group chat active but silent whenever I contributed. I felt like I was going crazy, like I was imagining the whole thing, but also knowing deep down that something had shifted, and I wasn't imagining it at all. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I reached out to Jess, someone I'd considered my closest friend in the group, someone I'd known since college. I asked her directly what was going on, why everyone seemed to be avoiding me, if I'd done something to upset people. At first, she tried to brush it off, said I was overthinking things, that everyone was just busy. But I pushed, told her I needed the truth, that the silence was worse than whatever the actual problem was. She reluctantly admitted that Kayla, another member of our friend group, had been spreading lies about me for months. According to Jess, Kayla had been telling people that I'd been talking badly about everyone behind their backs, sharing secrets they'd told me in confidence, calling people names, saying I was toxic and manipulative. None of it was true. Not a single word, but Kayla had been methodical about it, pulling people aside one by one, playing the concerned friend, warning them about me, positioning herself as the person trying to protect the group from my supposed toxicity. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. These were people I'd trusted, people I'd spent years building friendships with, and they'd believed lies about me without ever once asking me directly if any of it was true. And Kayla, someone I'd considered a friend, had deliberately destroyed my reputation to make herself look better. Jess explained that Kayla had been positioning herself as the group leader, the person everyone should trust and confide in, and apparently the easiest way to do that was to create a common enemy, me. By making me the villain, she'd united everyone else and made herself indispensable as the one holding the group together. I was devastated, but I was also furious. I wasn't going to let someone destroy years of friendships with lies and manipulation without at least trying to set the record straight. I started gathering evidence, screenshots of actual conversations I'd had with people, showing that I hadn't said the things Kayla claimed I had. Messages where I'd supported friends through hard times, kept confidences, been there when people needed me. I organized everything chronologically, built a clear picture of what my actual interactions with the group had been versus what Kayla had told everyone. Then I wrote a message to the group. I kept it calm and factual, no emotional outbursts, no attacking Kayla directly. I just laid out what I'd learned, explained that lies had been spread about me, and presented the evidence showing what I'd actually said and done. I addressed each specific claim Kayla had made and provided proof that contradicted it. Then I sent it to the main group chat. The response was immediate. People started reading through the screenshots, comparing what I'd shown them to what Kayla had told them privately. The timeline didn't match. The tone of my messages was completely different from what they'd been led to believe. Several people started asking Kayla for her side, asking her to explain the discrepancies, and here's where it gets absurd. Kayla tried to backtrack, started saying she must have misunderstood, that maybe she'd mixed up conversations, that she'd never meant to spread false information. She tried to frame it as a big misunderstanding, like she genuinely believed what she was saying and had only been trying to help. But the evidence was too clear. The lies had been too specific, too calculated. There was no way to spin this as an innocent mistake. The group was horrified. People started apologizing to me, saying they should have come to me directly instead of just believing what they'd heard. Some admitted they'd felt uncomfortable with how quickly everyone had turned against me, but hadn't wanted to go against the group consensus. Others said they'd had doubts about Kayla's stories, but hadn't wanted to cause drama by questioning her. Kayla's credibility was destroyed. The person she'd positioned herself as, the trustworthy friend looking out for everyone, was revealed to be someone willing to lie and manipulate to get what she wanted. People started re-evaluating other things she'd said, other situations where maybe she'd been the common denominator in group conflicts. Several people reached out to me privately after that, apologizing again, asking if we could rebuild our friendships, and I appreciated the apologies. I really did. But I also realized something important. These people had believed lies about me without question. They'd iced me out for months without ever once asking for my side of the story. They'd been willing to throw away years of friendship based on one person's word. If they believed her that easily, were they really friends worth keeping? I distanced myself from the group entirely, not out of spite or revenge, but because I realized the foundation of those friendships wasn't as solid as I'd thought. Real friends don't believe the worst about you without giving you a chance to defend yourself. Real friends ask questions when something doesn't add up. Real friends don't participate in quietly ostracizing someone based on rumors. I've since built a smaller, healthier circle. People who communicate directly when there's a problem, who don't engage in behind-the-back gossip, who value honesty over drama. The difference is incredible. I'd rather have 5 genuine friendships than 20 superficial ones that could evaporate the second someone whispers the right lie. Quality over quantity, always. The whole experience taught me that not everyone who smiles at you is your friend, and not everyone who claims to have your back actually does. Some people are more interested in their own position within a group than in genuine connection. And when someone shows you they're willing to sacrifice you for their own benefit, believe them. Kayla stayed in the group for a while after everything came out, but it was never the same for her. People were cautious around her, less willing to share personal information, more skeptical of things she said. Eventually, she drifted away, probably found a new group to manipulate. I don't know, and I don't care. She's not my problem anymore. I'm in a better place now, surrounded by people who actually value me, who wouldn't believe lies without checking in first, who communicate like adults instead of playing high school social games. And I'm grateful for what happened in a weird way. It showed me who my real friends were and forced me to build something better. If you've made it this far, you've survived 15 stories of betrayal, manipulation, and people who thought they could get away with it. Remember, the truth always has a way of coming out, and standing up for yourself is never the wrong choice, even when it costs you relationships or comfort. Sweet dreams, everyone, and remember, tomorrow's chaos is just a Reddit post away. Until next time, stay skeptical, stay strong, and never let anyone make you the villain in your own story.